Hello. How are you doing, wonderful people? And welcome to the second episode of Clearing the Smoke, the podcast to help you clear your mind and clear your lungs. And I am your host, Albert Daniel Cesar. And for our second episode, I'll be talking about the history of smoking here in the Philippines, as well as the advertising and marketing tactics used by cigarette companies. But before we start, I would like to give a shout out to my podcast mates, the Go On Podcast, the Brain Buzz Podcast, the Cloud Room Podcast, Nicotine Free Ellie, Lee Audios, Talk the Talk with Migs, the Brief Easy Podcast, the Spicy Podcast, the Nicotine Chronicles, the Smokecast, Cloud9 Podcast, Smoke Free Podcast, and lastly, the Free Mind Clear Lungs Podcast. And if you're interested in checking out their content, which I highly recommend doing, I will link their channels below in the description as well as in the comments section. Also, I would like to apologize for the really long wait, and as you guys can recall, I announced that the second episode will come on May 16, and look at the date today, let's just say that I'm very off schedule. I have been working this script on and off as I was really busy with my other assessments, which really took time from finishing it. Aside from academics, I also wanted to really go in depth with the topic, especially with the local history and marketing parts of this episode. That and I intended this episode to be part 1 of 2, with the second part focusing more on the marketing tactics used on the youth, the prevalence of smoking and vaping among the youth, and the financial and social aspects of smoking and vaping. Thank you all for your continued patience and support for this podcast, and let's begin this episode. Now, smoking has been around for a very long time, and for something that is inherently harmful, has basically ingrained itself into society to the point that it is considered as a part of our culture and has become essential to some people's everyday routine. Last episode, I talked about the physical and psychological effects of smoking, how addiction works, and ways to avoid smoking and secondhand smoke. But for today, we will be focusing on the history of smoking here in the Philippines. But don't worry, I will also give you guys a quick general history of smoking. We will also cover the marketing tactics used by cigarette companies. So without further ado, welcome to the second episode of Clearing the Smoke. So sit back, relax, and as always, thank you for tuning in. Let's start this episode off with a quick history lesson on smoking. Now, this is more of a general overview of the history and won't be as detailed as a segment covering the Philippines history. But if you want to learn more, feel free to browse through the sources in the description box and comments section. Okay, so the earliest evidence of tobacco use in human history was 12,300 years ago. So yes, even when mammoths roamed the earth, cavemen were smoking tobacco. According to an article by Nature Human Behavior covering an archaeological research done in 2021, an excavation done at the Wishbone site led to the discovery of early inhabitants of North America's desert west. Now, it is unclear to how they used these tobacco seeds, as the researchers were unsure if they smoked it like how we do now or if they had their own technique. But the fact that these seeds were present in a place like this gave them an idea of how they used them. Moving on, so this segment will just be a read of the timeline of the history of tobacco, courtesy of Tobacco Free Life, and this is a pretty good and easy to understand resource that covers most of the major global events in the history of tobacco. And as I mentioned earlier, this will just be a general overview. So yeah, moving on. Tobacco and tobacco-related products have a long history that traces back to 6000 BC. The plant today known as tobacco, or Nicotiana tabacum, is a member of the Nicotiana genus, a close relative to the poisonous nightshade, and could previously only be found in the Americas. In 1492, Columbus was warmly greeted by the Native American tribes he encountered when he first set foot on the new continent. They brought gifts of fruit, food, spears, and more, and among those gifts were dried up leaves of the tobacco plant. As they were not edible and had a distinct smell to them, those leaves which the American natives had been smoking for over 2 millennia for medicinal and religious purposes were thrown overboard. However, Columbus soon realized that dried tobacco leaves are a prized possession among the natives, as they bartered with them and often bestowed them as a gift. Rodrigo de Jerez and Luis de Torres are the first Europeans to observe smoking. It was on Cuba and Jerez became a staunch smoker, bringing the habit back to him with Spain. Jerez's neighbors were so petrified of the smoke coming out of his mouth and nose that he was soon arrested by the Holy Inquisition and held in captivity for nearly 7 years. However, thanks to a lot of seafarers at the time, smoking became an entrenched habit in both Spain and Portugal before long. And in the 15th century, Portuguese sailors were planting tobacco around nearly all of their trading outposts, enough for personal use and gifts. And by mid-century, they started growing tobacco commercially in Brazil. It was soon a sought-after commodity and traded across the ports in Europe and the Americas. By the end of the 16th century, tobacco plant and use of tobacco were both introduced to virtually every single country in Europe. Tobacco was snuffed or smoked, depending the preference, and doctors claimed that it had medicinal properties. Some, such as Nicolas Monardes in 1571, went as far as to write a book to outline 36 specific ailments that tobacco could supposedly cure. Tobacco products gained a strong foothold in the US somewhere around the Revolutionary War. War and tobacco go hand in hand, as you will soon see in 1776 that it was used by the revolutionaries as collateral for the loans they were getting from France. In 1847, this was the year when Philip Morris was established in the UK. They were first to start selling hand-rolled turkey cigarettes, and the practice was soon picked up by J.E. Liggett and Brother, an American company established in St. Louis in 1849. Even though chewing tobacco was the most popular form of tobacco in the 19th century, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company was founded in 1875 and produced chewing tobacco exclusively. Cigarettes were slowly taken away. Cigarettes truly came to popularity after the invention of the cigarette-making machine by James Bonsack in 1881. He went into business. James Buckbeard and the American Tobacco Company was born. The ATC survives today as a part of the British American Tobacco, a global company with reported revenues of $13,104 billion in 2015. Cigarettes came to the height of their popularity during the First and Second World War. Tobacco companies sent millions of packs of cigarettes to soldiers on the front line, creating hundreds of thousands of faithful and addicted customers in the process. Cigarettes were even included into the soldiers' C rations, which contained mostly food and supplements, along with cigarettes. The 1920s were also the period when tobacco companies started marketing heavily to women, creating brands such as Mildest May to try to feminize the habit and make it more appealing to women. The number of female smokers in the United States tripled by 1935. Dangers associated with nicotine are nothing new. Ever since people started smoking, there were those farsighted enough to suggest that the habit is dangerous and addictive. In the early 17th century, a Chinese philosopher, Fang Yi pointed out the dangers of smoking, noting that it caused scorched lungs. Sir Francis Bacon noticed that there was something addictive about the tobacco way back in 1610, saying that it's a tough habit to kick. People back then did not know about the addictive nature of nicotine, or that nicotine was even a component of tobacco. In Great Britain, snuff users were warned about the dangers of nose cancer as early as 1761, while German doctors started warning pipe smokers about the possibility of developing lip cancer in 1975. In the 1930s, American doctors started linking tobacco use to lung cancer, and General Surgeon's report from 1964 definitely states that smoking causes cancer in men. Tobacco and tobacco products are more regulated today. Companies have lost countless lawsuits and are now forced to clearly label their products as having a detrimental effect on the health of a person. Also, tobacco advertising is severely limited and regulated. Still, tobacco companies make billions of dollars in revenue every year, destroying the health of others. It's estimated that around 1 billion tobacco users are in the world today. The damage caused by this addiction and its peddlers numbers in trillions of dollars of health expenses and environmental damages, and more effort has to be made to educate people, especially teenagers and young adults, about the dangers of smoking. Okay, so now that you all have the general knowledge of the history of smoking, let's jump straight into its history here in the Philippines. As I was researching this topic, I came across this very comprehensive overview of the Philippines' history with tobacco on the National Tobacco Administration website, so I'm just gonna give you guys a rundown of the stuff that I found. So in 1492, Columbus observed Arawak Indians smoking tobacco, and 7 years later, Vespucci noted inhabitants chewing dried leaves on an island near Venezuela. The Spaniards discovered advanced tobacco cultivation in Mexico when they invaded in 1519. As seafaring Spaniards and Portuguese searched for spices and converted people to Christianity, they introduced tobacco to mainland Europe, the East Indies, and Asia. Spanish galleons carried various treasures, including tobacco seeds from the New World. By the late 16th century, tobacco use had spread throughout most civilized regions due to colonization efforts. Smoking gained more popularity than Christianity. The Spaniards conducted tobacco cultivation experiments in their colonies, including the Philippines, where Augustinian friars bought 6,289 kilograms of cigar tobacco seeds in the last quarter of the 16th century. Tobacco became a significant commodity in the galleon trade. The Spaniards recognized the potential for wealth and income through tobacco. It could provide significant revenue for Spain and the Spanish government in the Philippines. Considering the demand for tobacco by Spain and other countries, the colonizers contemplated commercializing tobacco cultivation and establishing a tobacco monopoly to ensure sustained revenue. Consequently, the Spaniards' attention was divided between growing tobacco and introducing Christianity to the Filipinos. Tobacco, in the form of smoke and snuff, gained immense popularity among the Spaniards, other foreigners, and even Filipinos in the Philippines. However, it was not until the latter part of the 18th century that the colonial government fully realized the potential for exploiting its popularity. The establishment of the tobacco monopoly in 1782 was prompted by the need to raise funds for defending the island against Muslim warriors residing in the unconquered parts of the Philippines. The imposition of the monopoly forced Filipino farmers, particularly those in the Ilocos region and Cagayan Valley, to cultivate tobacco. Each farmer was assigned a production quota. Initially, the farmers were treated fairly and received fair prices for their crops. However, as time passed, the Filipinos developed a strong aversion to tobacco, not due to the challenges of cultivation, but because of the abuses committed by the Spaniards who coerced them into growing the crop. From its inception, the tobacco monopoly sparked misunderstandings. Initially, its operations were limited to Manila and the 8 central provinces of Luzon. These included Tondo, Cavite, Batangas, Tayabas, Laguna, Pampanga, Bataan, and Bulacan. To mitigate the radical and burdensome impact of the monopoly, tobacco production was tied to the country's economic development program. Those granted permission to grow tobacco were promised timely and adequate payment for their produce. Rather than being grown on large plantations under government control, tobacco was cultivated on small plots by individual farmers. This necessitated negotiations with numerous farmers, resulting in hundreds of separate contracts and requiring more people to oversee the process. Collectors were appointed to gather leaves from all tobacco growing areas. These collectors acted as intermediaries between the government and the farmers, retaining the difference between what the government provided them for payment and what they actually paid the farmers. After numerous complaints, the collection of leaves was placed under direct government administration, ensuring fair treatment and accurate pricing for the farmers. The tobacco monopoly exacerbated the exploitation of Filipinos under the guise of religious devotion and obedience to the Spanish crown, leading to growing hostility among the people. As the monopoly generated numerous problems for Spanish officials and the populace, proposals emerged to abolish it and instead have Filipinos pay double tribute. Alternative crops could have been cultivated to reduce hatred toward the Spaniards. In Professor Ed De Jesus' book, The Tobacco Monopoly, he stated that the reason why liberal Spaniards were lobbying for the monopoly's abolition was partly due to their fear of the Filipinos revolting against the Spanish instead of their initial intent of stopping the abuse faced by the Filipinos. Ultimately, the monopoly not only compelled the people, especially those in the northern region and Cagayan, to grow tobacco, but to also force them to produce more than their land could sustain. The collection process alone reduced Filipinos to virtual servitude, with violators facing 25 lashes for failing to transport the produce on their backs. The abolition of the tobacco monopoly in 1882 was driven by factors such as tobacco smuggling, banditry, unjust administration of the monopoly, and declining income, the coerced cultivation of tobacco was abandoned, except for crops grown for personal consumption by those who had acquired a taste for smoking. Nevertheless, knowledge of tobacco cultivation persisted. Tobacco had a stranglehold in the Filipino consciousness. Tobacco was being used to exploit Filipino farmers for profit, even to the point that the Spanish would convince the Filipinos to do it to prove their devotion to them and to God. Even before all of the tension and the eventual conflict, tobacco, after its introduction, became very popular within the Filipinos, even to the point that smoking was a very common and accepted practice among families. Chief evidence being this photo taken in 1912 by photographer James David Gibbons titled "Smoking the Family Cigar," and it's exactly as you thought it would be. A picture of a Filipino smoking this really huge cigar. So yes, from the 16th century all the way to the 20th, smoking huge cigars was a favorite Filipino pastime. Even after the monopoly's abolition, tobacco would still find a way to the Filipinos' mouths, as historical documents reveal that the First Philippine Republic under General Emilio Aguinaldo distributed cigarillos to soldiers of the nascent Filipino army. The Filipinos retained their cultural heritage of smoking, sniffing, or chewing tobacco, and the knowledge of growing the crop. Unlike during the monopoly era, tobacco cultivation was now carried out according to the people's preferences. In line with efforts to improve tobacco production and enhance its quality, the Tobacco Inspection Law was enacted on February 4, 1916. Under this law, the Bureau of Agriculture was tasked with procuring seeds from well-developed tobacco plants, cleaning them using machine, and distributing them freely to growers. It became illegal for tobacco producers to cure, dry, ferment, or treat the leaves in any building other than the designated curing sheds specified by the Bureau of Agriculture. The Director of Forestry was authorized to grant licenses to tobacco producers to cut first-class timber for the construction of curing warehouses. Additionally, farmers who excelled in tobacco production were recognized and awarded diplomas to incentivize them to cultivate the finest leaves. Inspection fees were collected and contributed to the inspection fund, with 30% of the fund allocated for the establishment and maintenance of tobacco experimental farms. During the 100-year tobacco monopoly, the Philippines cultivated various types of tobacco, including sun-cured and air-cured wrappers and filtered tobacco. Filler tobacco. Successful cultivation of new cigar varieties derived from seeds originating from the United States and the Netherlands East Indies was achieved. Additionally, tobacco types for cigarette manufacturing were grown using seeds from the United States, Turkey, and Russia. In 1927, the adaptability of Virginia or flue-cured tobacco to the soil and climate conditions in Ilagan Agricultural Station Isabela was tested. In 1492, Japan sent a small team to assess the soil, climate, rainfall, and weather conditions in La Union, one of the Ilocos provinces in northwestern Luzon, for potential tobacco cultivation areas, with the intention of eventually incorporating Philippines as its territory. The team found that the conditions in La Union resembled those of areas where flue-cured tobacco was grown in Japan. During World War II, small quantities of flue-cured tobacco were grown by the Japanese using seeds from Japan and Formosa, now known as Taiwan. The 1949 to 1950 season witnessed the production of the best commercially grown flue-cured tobacco in the Philippines. Although attempts to cultivate burley tobacco were not yet successful, small amounts of this type and oriental tobacco were already being experimented with. The economic significance of tobacco in the Philippines has undergone significant changes since the outbreak of World War II. During this time, exports of tobacco greatly declined while imports increased substantially. In 1950, the Philippines exported 3,674,136 kilograms of unmanufactured tobacco, a stark contrast to the pre-war annual average of 60,919,169 kilograms from 1935 to 1949. Similarly, cigar exports reached an all-time low of 2.1 million pieces in 1950, compared to the pre-war average of 202 million pieces. Additionally, only 14,000 pieces of cigarettes were exported in 1950, a significant decrease from the 37.3 million pieces exported in the pre-war years. This decline in exports was primarily attributed to the closure of European markets during the war, changing consumer preferences from cigars to cigarettes, and the shortage of foreign exchange. Before World War II, the Philippines primarily exported unmanufactured tobacco to countries such as Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, Korea, and Japan. Some shipments were also sent to French Africa, the United States, China, Belgium, and the French East Indies. The United States, however, was the sole source of the blending tobacco for the country's cigarette factories. The city of Manila served as a hub of the tobacco manufacturing industry in the Philippines, and by June 1951, there were 51 government-licensed cigarette factories, with 10 of them producing 75% of the country's machine-made cigarettes. The remaining 25% came from a licensed factory in Cebu, along with several clandestine factories scattered throughout the country. According to a foreign agricultural report done in 1952, while cigar products were predominantly handmade and known for their excellent quality, chewing and smoking tobacco products held substantial market share, while snuff tobacco had limited significance. In 1952, Republic Act 698 was enacted to restrict the importation of Virginia tobacco. This legislation mandated that all locally grown and produced Virginia tobacco be purchased by the government, fixing the price for both flue-cured and sun-dried Virginia leaf tobacco. The Philippine Tobacco Administration (PTA) was tasked with assisting the Agricultural Credit Cooperative and Financing Administration (ACCFA) in producing and procuring the leaves. Harry Stonehill, a retired United States Army lieutenant, played a significant role in introducing tobacco seeds from America. He distributed free manuals on flue-curing tobacco leaves and provided the seeds to farmers in Ilocos Sur, and Ilocos Norte, and in Abra. Stonehill also established the flue-curing barns in Agoo and San Juan, La Union, as well as in Santa Barbara and San Jacinto, Pangasinan. He also founded the Philippine Tobacco Flue-Curing and Redrying Corporation, or the PTFCRC, in collaboration with tobacco expert John Whitney and businessman Peter Lim. Together, they spearheaded the Virginia tobacco industry. Aside from its deep history, another way that smoking has ingrained itself into modern society is through its marketing. For this segment, I will be focusing more on Marlboro's advertising because it's the most popular and well-known brand here in the Philippines. Although, I will be mentioning the attempts at marketing done by other companies as well. One of the most noteworthy attempts at marketing these tiny sticks of death was the Marlboro Man. The image of this gruff and tough masculine cowboy became synonymous with the company's brand and helped establish their identity and ultimately set them apart from their competition in the early 50s all the way until its gradual decline. Prior to the Marlboro Man, Marlboro marketed their filtered cigarettes towards women and used slogans such as "Mild as May," "Ivory Tips to Protect the Lips," or "Red Beauty Tips to Protect Your Lips and Fingertips." And as said in the slogan, the cigarettes featured red tips to prevent smearing of lipstick. According to Insider, while they tapped in an unexplored market and found success in a loyal customer base of women, the same can't be said about their market share, as they had only 1% of the domestic share compared to their competitors. That, and along with the growing awareness of the dangers of smoking and fears of losing the male market, Marlboro had to switch up their tactics. Thus, the Marlboro Man rode into the scene. Created by Lee Burnett, the Marlboro Man made his debut in 1954 and was made to appeal to the male market, whilst easing the growing health concerns and reassuring male consumers that filtered cigarettes are manly. How did he ease the consumers' fears, you may ask? Simple. Make the consumers forget that this life-threatening product is harmful through this advertising campaign that appeals to their values and lifestyle. So back then, if there was a problem, just forget it, sugarcoat it, and make bank while you're at it. Despite having little to no documentation of its promotion in the Philippines, the only resource that I could find mentioning them is just one blog documenting the use of the country's landmarks in their posters. Although this blog mentioned that the ads were effective, I am unsure of this information. But at the same time, considering the popularity of the Marlboro brand here in this country and its love for American and foreign brands in general, it would be safe to assume that these ads were effective. According to isang Manang Patalastas, these ads were introduced to the Philippines at the beginning of 1965 and featured the iconic cowboys superimposed on the images of the country's exotic locales. From the cities of Manila to the natural wonders of the Banawi rice terraces, the Marlboro Man has done it all. They combined the beautiful landscapes with the idea of this free-roaming cowboy to sell this adventurous lifestyle that would be complete with the unfiltered taste of Marlboro's filtered cigarettes. So if you want to be a real man who's ready to take on life's challenges while being his own boss, you gotta smoke Marlboro, man. So, the Marlboro Man sold a lifestyle that greatly appealed to the values men had back in their era. Most of the ads didn't feature the cigarettes at all and would mostly focus on the man himself just doing manly things like riding horses, taking care of livestock, or flying planes. Marlboro had something that other cigarette companies don't, which is an identity. Marlboro made it feel like smoking was cool, and while other companies were boring potential customers by convincing them that their products are better and safe when statistics and obviously false testimonies from doctors, Marlboro breezed through the contest and they were the first of its kind. Now, what is lifestyle advertising? According to a Medium article done by Jason Bodie, he defined it as creating a connection between a product or service and the consumer's lifestyle. It aims to create a sense of connection between the consumer and the product by emphasizing the lifestyle that the product or service can help to create or improve. The company's advertising sold a feeling. It attributed smoking to freedom and masculinity and made smoking enticing without the need to bore you with all these statistics and research. It basically told people, hey, if you're this tough and hardworking man, smoke our cigarettes, or you want to be as cool as this cowboy, smoke Marlboro, without being too in your face with their approach. People did not smoke because it was safe and that the doctor approved of these products. People smoked to feel cool. Now, if you want to watch a really cool video on how Marlboro utilized lifestyle marketing, I highly suggest watching Coffee Break's video on it. It's just 3 minutes, but it's really good. Now, in an article done by Esther Berlich done in 2020, they stated that the company associated smoking Marlboro with masculinity. All men who smoke Marlboro are hardworking and kind of better than the ones not smoking Marlboro. And this was all dressed up with the character of a cowboy riding freely in the wild nature of America. Furthermore, in a research done by the Stanford University, they stated that the Marlboro Man would exude rugged manliness in an effort to position Marlboro as a filter with flavor. Previously, most filter cigarettes were considered to be sissy or effeminate, lacking in flavor and meant for those who couldn't handle stronger brands. With the Marlboro Man campaign, Philip Morris worked to reverse this sentiment. The original Marlboro Man were excessive in their masculine virility. The models range from rough cowboys and sailors to alluring businessmen and academics. Whether the Marlboro Man was pictured preparing his gun or playing chess, he always sported a military-inspired tattoo in the back of his hand. In 1960, the tattoo was discontinued, but its message, that of intrigue and masculinity, remained vibrant in the Marlboro Men of the decades to follow. Advertising which portrays smokers as fearless, like cowboys, soldiers, athletes, and macho men in general, is a means of conveying health reassurance. Smokers who identify with such imagery perceive that they, like the smoking role models portrayed in these ads, are too brave to fear smoking. Smoking is a very public badge of their fearlessness and willingness to face danger with indifference because they are immune to such anxieties. As mentioned earlier, the Marlboro Man campaign appealed to men of that era because it conformed to and associated with the notions of masculinity, freedom, and boldness. In a research done by Murray Milner Jr. in 2011 titled The Rise and Fall of an Icon, The Case of the Marlboro Man, he stated that the Marlboro Man conformed to these said ideals and associated the notion of smoking as a way of conforming to these beliefs. He went on to cite one commercial that featured a wild stallion stealing a rancher's mares, and as a cowhand is in pursuit of the stallion, the rancher lights up a Marlboro cigarette and contemplates on the situation. He then chose to whistle the cowhand to stop the chase and comments that wild stallions are one of a kind. Milner states that this commercial not only suggests that smoking is a way of affirming and conforming to the norms of freedom and singularity, but that but that wildness or risky behavior should be respected. Basically, the whole point of this strategy is to make smoking look cool, to the point that people would forget that this product is harmful. Marlboro's tactics were ingenious and paid off in spades as Marlboro saw an immediate rise in sales. In 1955, right after the implementation of the Marlboro Man campaign, their sales were at $5 billion, and by 1957, they were at $20 billion, which represented a 300% increase within 2 years. In David Ogilvy's biography done by Kenneth Roman in 2009 titled The Kings of Madison Avenue, David commented that Philip Morris easily overcame the health concerns, and this highlights the tobacco industry's ability to use mass marketing to influence the public into consuming their products. However, Miller's essay also stated that an increasing number of medical research against smoking and cultural revolutions and historical revision greatly contributed to the demise of the Marlboro Man. While the first one is self-explanatory, I want to tell you guys more about the Cultural Revolution and the historical revisionist movements. Milner cited that the cultural revolutions of the 1960s and 1970s challenged traditional notions of the West and macho culture. Feminism gained momentum during this period, questioning women's subordinate status and the validity of male-centric perspectives. Books like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice played a significant role in these discussions. Apart from cultural revolutions, a historical revisionism movement which aimed to redefine the Wild West as one of conquest rather than a heroic adventure. Protests from Native Americans, as well as scholarly studies such as Francis Jennings' 1975 study The Invasion of America, Indians, Colonialism, and the Cant of Conquest, along with media such as D. Brown's 1970 bestseller Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and his 2008 TV film adaptation which details the effects of Western expansionism on the Native Americans, essentially debunked the romanticized perception that cowboys were these heroes who lived simple lives during the Wild West. These works served to show the perspective of Native Americans during the Indian Wars and portrayed cowboys not as traditional heroes but as morally ambiguous people, and sometimes villains. This movement led people to view the events of the Wild West in a different light, one that highlighted the atrocities done against the Indians. Aside from the Western Revision movement, the environmental movement also highlighted the negative consequences of the Western expansion on the environment. With all of those combined, the Marlboro Man's cool factor took a hit. As I was researching this topic, I came across this obscure documentary titled Death in the West, which was released back in 1976 by filmmaker Martin Smith, and this serves as an expose of Marlboro and other cigarette companies in general. The documentary is composed of old Marlboro commercials, interviews with 6 cowboys and their doctors, and 2 Philip Morris executives. Now, after the film opens with a Marlboro commercial, it cuts to an interview with Bob Julian, a 51-year-old cowboy in Wyoming who said that he has been smoking ever since he was a kid, and says that I thought that to be a man, you had to have a cigarette in your mouth. It took me years to discover that all I got out of it was lung cancer, and I'm going to die a young man. It then cuts to Julian's doctor stating that no industrial pollution contributed to his lung cancer as he lived in a rural area, but it was his smoking that caused it. And then the next segment shows their interview with James Bowling, the senior vice president of Philip Morris, who basically just deflects the question and refuses to take accountability by saying it's a customer's choice to smoke, and that it's just business and it's their fault for being addicted to cigarettes in the first place. The other executive interviewed in this talk is Dr. Helmut Wickham, who fails to defend their products and even compared smoking addiction to eating too much applesauce. In another scene, we see cowboy John Holmes ride a horse around this field, but something's wrong with his image, and shows us an oxygen tank strapped into the horse, and we find out that John has emphysema because of his smoking. Now, I'm not gonna do a recap or summaries of the whole documentary because I think that this deserves a full watch. So what I'm gonna do is send a link to the full documentary in the description. If you're someone who's interested in the history of smoking and wants to learn more about how people back then viewed smoking, I think that this doc is a must watch. Now, I know what you're asking. Why haven't I heard of this documentary before? Its obscure status is because shortly after the doc aired in 1976, Philip Morris sued Thames Television, which barred the film from being shown anywhere. A report done by Mother Jones in January 1979 covering the lawsuit stated that Philip Morris promptly sued Thames Television and they got a court order preventing the film from being shown until its suit could be heard. The order even prohibits the filmmakers from discussing the film publicly. Aside from suing the filmmakers and barring any showing of it in the USA, Philip Morris also spent some money trying to discredit the cowboys or ranchers featured in the doc. In an interview with John Holmes, he recalls that they sent a couple lawyers from Kansas City to see me. They just showed up on my doorstep. They wanted to prove that maybe other things than cigarettes had caused my emphysema. They were very sly in their questions. One of the men took down everything I said like a court reporter. They wanted to know how long I had been in the cattle business. Was it my vocation or avocation? I've had this ranch for 20 years, but they tried to make a big thing of the fact that some of the time I was also teaching school. And if I'm gonna be honest, I have to applaud the sheer bravery of these filmmakers for calling out such a huge company at that time. They called out a really big company in their peak, and even taking the battle to their doorsteps by actually interviewing two of their executives. But alas, I think that their efforts are kind of in vain as due to the lawsuit, people have limited access to the documentary, and that other copies of the film were destroyed by orders of Philip Morris while the original is sealed away in the London court vault. But there is a way to watch it as someone uploaded in Dailymotion, and the link to it is down in the description box. I want to bring this documentary to your guys' attention and hopefully contribute to the anti-smoking cause. Now, during the Marlboro Man's heyday, other companies tried to get their own slice of the pie. One of these attempts is the Camel's brand of cigarettes' equally short-lived yet equally successful mascot, Joe Camel, who also had a weird history of his own. Created in 1974 by Bill Colton and was introduced in the American market by 1998, and Joe Camel was subject to a JAMA, or Journal of the American Medical Association article that claimed that Joe Camel appealed to teenagers and this contributed to underage smoking. Although this was disproven, as in John E. Calfee's 2000 retrospective analysis on Joe Camel titled The Historical Significance of Joe Camel, he criticized that the JAMA studies were inaccurate and unreliable, and contended that many of the claims made in the journal lacked substantiation or were based on flawed research. He asserted that the anti-smoking campaign influenced by these studies had little to no impact on reducing youth smoking rates, as he observed a decline in rates between 1987 and 1992. Calfee's analysis also revealed that Camel's market share among young smokers had only increased from 4% to 12% in 1992 to 93, subsequently dropping to 9%. These figures significantly differ from the range of 0.5 to 32.8% reported in the JAMA studies. Calfee further highlighted that the campaign led to a shift in how lawmakers evaluated cigarette advertising, moving away from relying solely on market share data and instead focusing on reviewing internal documents of tobacco companies to discern their motivations and intentions. Nowadays, the Marlboro Man doesn't see any use in commercials, even Joe Camel. However, the cowboy or the camel can still be seen in vending machines and old posters scattered throughout the world, serving as a reminder of a bygone era of rampant tobacco promotion and consumption. Or maybe people still think that it's cool. With people being a bit more aware of the repercussions of smoking, I mean, the government is requiring companies to put graphic warnings on cigarette boxes, along with price hikes in the pandemic, forcing people to be more frugal or at the very least reduce their smoking. Here in the Philippines, tobacco advertising is limited to posters and flyers as Republic Act 9211 or the Tobacco Regulation Act of 2003, which regulated the sale, advertising, and public use of tobacco, and is why the cigarettes and vapes have warning labels in their packaging. In Section 21 of the Republic Act of 1901, it covers the restriction of advertising on the internet and similar medium. It stated that advertisements are prohibited on the internet and other similar medium unless the internet site is restricted to persons 18 years of age or older. A site will be deemed restricted if a person cannot obtain access beyond the first page of the website unless a person has established that he or she is at least 18 years old. This limitation applies to commercial communications and shall not prevent the use of company internet websites to provide information regarding the company, its products and smoking and health related information. This section shall not prohibit business-to-business transaction conducted on the internet and other similar mediums between tobacco manufacturers and retailers and distributors. And in section 22, it stated that ban on advertisements beginning January 1, 2007, all tobacco advertising on television, cable television, and radio shall be prohibited. And they did all of this in order to prevent premature smoking. But the funny thing is that it wasn't that act that stopped smoking, but it was the economy did. The rising prices, the ever worsening financial situation of many people. Now, considering the financial situations of most of their customers, cigarette companies here in the Philippines switched up their tactics. Marlboro's, along with other cigarette companies, recent attempts at marketing their products is not through these quirky characters, but instead presenting themselves as budget yet quality option and the customer getting something in return, often with slogans such as "Siyete lang, may Marlboro ka na." Marlboro and other brands would often do promos and raffle draws where they would encourage buyers to buy packs of cigarettes so they could register it for a chance to win cars, gadgets, cash prizes, and so on. Aside from prizes, they are also aware of the financial situation of many people and understand the fact that Filipinos want something quick and cheap, so they would emphasize how cheap yet quality their cigarettes are in an effort to encourage buyers to smoke their products. But considering how addictive cigarettes are, the word budget and cigarette would, should, and could never be the same sentence together, as most likely smokers would run through their own money buying another stick or a pack, looking for another nicotine rush. Cigarettes still see use here in the Philippines, especially among middle and lower class folk, but are slowly becoming out of fashion as customers are starting to look for cheaper and safer alternatives, and thus a new problem arises. Enter vaping. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. Once again, I would like to thank all of you for tuning in for today's episode, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it. Join me next week as I'll be discussing the marketing and advertising tactics used by both tobacco and vaping companies to target young people, the impact of smoking and vaping, as well as the social and financial aspects of tobacco and vape use. Also, don't forget to support my podcast mates. Their channels are in both the description box and comment section. And if you want to show some love for this podcast, drop a like, subscribe, share, and as always, take care, everybody.